Hello, I'm joined by Rory today. So, Rory, tell everyone a little bit about yourself.
I'm 10 years old and I'm a swimmer.
And she brings it every day to training. So, it's been a pleasure training you, Rory. And today we're going to talk about sports science. So, do you have any idea what sports science is?
Not really.
Well, you know that we use the timer sometimes out at the
Yeah.
field.
Yeah.
So, sports science, do you know what science is?
Yes.
So, sports science is basically just applying the scientific method to getting better at sport. So, have you ever done like an experiment at school before?
Um, yes.
So one example of this is like if you have, well, the scientific method, I guess, is you have an idea or a hypothesis, right?
Mm-hmm.
You do your experiment, you collect some data, some numbers, and then you figure out what the data means, and then you kind of go in this circle. So, what kind of experiments have you done at school, if you remember?
We just did like a planet experiment. That's what we're working on right now. So we're trying to do optical illusions this week, which is really fun. And I think this week we're focusing on like why planets are so big.
Cool. Have you ever done an experiment where like you have you try to grow different plants and then you see how tall they grow? Have you ever done that
Yeah.
before? Yeah, so you have different seeds and then you have some in the sun, you have some in the dark, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have ideas of how tall they're going to grow. So that's your hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
And then you actually measure them, right? And then you get some
Yeah.
data. And then you make a conclusion on like what's the best for growing plants. So that's like the scientific method and how you would run an experiment.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to use an example and then we'll get to another example and then we'll get to sports specifically. So have you taken standardized tests before?
Mm-hmm.
No one likes them, right?
No.
So let's say you take a standardized test and you get a 95 out of 100. I know that you would get a 100 in real life, but so let's say you get a 95. So we have an idea or a guess of how you would get to 100. Let's say you get a 10 out of 10 on math, a 10 out of 10 on science, and a 9 out of 10 on social studies. So our hypothesis is going to be if we spend a little bit more time on social studies, then we can improve your overall score. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So then that's our hypothesis. Then throughout the school year, we would put a little bit more time into social studies. We could take a practice test halfway through to see how we're doing. And then at the end of the semester, we would take the standardized test again and see what happens. So in sport, we can get bigger, faster, stronger, or better at our actual sport. So like for swimming, we can spend more time in the pool. We can get faster on dry land. We can get stronger on dry land, et cetera, et cetera. So in sports science, we would say, you're a pretty good swimmer and you're pretty fast. But I think if we had a little bit of muscle and got a little bit stronger, we can make your times drop even lower. So with this hypothesis, we can somehow get data and quantify your swimming times, how strong you are, how fast you are with the lasers and things like that. So based on our hypothesis, then that's how we would plan training throughout the whole year. So that's basically how we do sports science in real life. So does that make sense?
Yes.
So if you had to summarize sports science now, kind of how would you describe it?
It's basically a hypothesis slash like getting stronger, faster, and all that.
And then how do we put that all together in training for our sport to help us perform the best?
So like getting faster would like make my times drop, and getting stronger would help me in practice. Like when I'm doing a race, it would help me go faster, and it would help me practice better. And yeah.
Yeah, but the thing is we only have a certain amount of hours in the day, right? So theoretically, all of those things could help you, but we have to figure out what would help the most. So that's where we can somehow put numbers on all of those and then make the best training plan for you. So that is all I have for sports science for my 10-year-old. So thank you, Rory, very much for joining me.
Yep.
Hello, Wyatt. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Oh, I'm fantastic. Wyatt is my high schooler. Can you please tell everyone a little bit about yourself first?
I am Wyatt Levy. I am 16. I go to New Trier High School, and I play hockey.
What a New Trier kid. But he's a hockey player. He's been training with me since the summer, so he's familiar with the training process. So first, do you know what sports science is?
I don't really know a broad definition, so no, not really.
So sports science, because we do a lot of stuff with the jump mat, with the lasers, or even just recording all of our weights that we lift. Sports science is applying the scientific method, science to sport. So are you familiar with the scientific method? Do you know what that is?
Yes.
So hypothesis, collect your data, conclusion, and you kind of go back and forth, right?
Yeah.
So in training and sport, our program is our hypothesis, right? We think if we do this program, our numbers will go up, and then we collect the numbers, and then we make a conclusion. And, every time I change our workouts up, I look at our past numbers and how it went. But it's important because in this training model, right, you have hockey, you have lifting, you have all of these other things, and we can actually quantify all of those. We can get number and data on all of those. And it's important because the higher up you get, you have to be a little bit more sophisticated on how you manipulate those variables. So one thing that we've started doing is I'll ask you your SRPE for every session. So my hypothesis is that your SRPE will be a certain number, and depending on if it's the beginning set of workouts or towards the end, it should be lower and go to higher. And sports science helps me figure out if I actually accomplished my plan. So is there anything that you guys do kind of at hockey practice, even like PE class or stuff like that, where you're trying to quantify your training or working out?
My coach, it's kind of like a general understanding. Like he can tell by like the mood and how we are towards like the end of practices. He doesn't really ask us like how do we feel. And each practice is different because sometimes at hockey, we don't have a game till it's like a Monday, and we don't have a game till like Friday or the weekend. So we're not going all out. We're kind of getting more like back into shape because a lot of my practices have to do with like just stamina and like just continuing to have the same energy in the beginning of the practice toward the end. But my coach gets an understanding of how we're feeling just based on how the energy is towards the end of the practices.
So do you know what that type of evidence or data is called when your coach is just using his coach's eye?
Observational data.
Observational, anecdotal. Yeah.
Yeah.
So do you know what internal versus external load is?
Not really.
So what you mentioned about your coach, so internal load is the load you experience, your SRPE, your heart rate, whatever. External load is how many yards you skate, how many shots you take, et cetera, where it's the same across the board. So your coach, it might not be as formal as writing it down and like specifically planning it out, but if we were to quantify those things of his practice, would you expect the external load as you get closer to the game to go down, right? And would you expect the internal load to stay somewhat the same? Like you said, the energy staying the same the whole practice. So it's still intense, but yeah, we can manipulate those variables of internal, external load, closer to game, external goes down, and things like that. So that's cool that sports science more formally is actually writing down those things, but everyone has these ideas. That's his hypothesis, right? Is that if I do this leading up to a game, we can increase our performance, and then you can track your practice throughout the week, and then you can track your games from week to week and see if the stats improved. So it's really just all of these variables, how do we manipulate them based on our plan, and then this feedback loop, and we kind of go from there. So if you had to try to summarize sports science now, what would you say?
It's kind of the overall ideology of mental and physical attributes, and kind of using like your progress and kind of seeing like an overall growth using like data and in your head and what you can see with your eyes.
Yeah, and putting it all together in this training model, trying to get just one more puck in the back of the net than the other team, you know?
Yeah.
So that is all I have for you today. Thank you, Wyatt, very much for your time, and I'm looking forward to training you next.
Thank you very much for having me.
Today I'm joined by Nick. Nick is my college guy. How are you doing today?
I'm great. How about you?
I'm doing fantastic. Always a good day when I can talk sports science. So could you please share a little bit about your background and your experiences kind of in this space and field?
Well, I'm currently a senior at Loras College studying kinesiology, working towards my graduate degree and becoming a college strength coach. I'm interning here with the strength coach at Loras College, and I also interned at TC Boost over the summer.
So Nick is no stranger to the training process. He's also pretty strong himself in some powerlifting, but he's familiar with the training process and coaching and just strength and conditioning in general. So if you had to give a definition of sports science, what would you say?
A broad definition of sports science, I guess in my words, would be kind of combining nutrition, biomechanics, different movements in the weight room, and seeing how they impact athletic performance on the field.
Yeah, 100%. And even taking just a quick step back to go forward later. So sports science, right? The science of sport, the scientific method to getting better at sport. And with this training model, right, you know all of these components of training for high performance. You have the weight room, you have the actual sport itself, the nutritionist, the sports psychologist, et cetera, et cetera. And the cool thing is that we can quantify and get data on literally every single component. So it's how do we do the scientific method of hypothesis, data, conclusion, right? To then get better at sport. It's kind of this process that goes back. But often people forget that hypothesis could also be used in saying a program, right? With a program, you have this guess or this plan of what's going to happen. You collect your data, and then you make a conclusion. Did it work or not work? Kind of how you thought. So what's kind of your experience and just experience kind of working with data in this sports setting?
I haven't really used a lot of data so far in my short stint in this profession, but I've used it a little bit in powerlifting because I've created programs for myself and my friends. We kind of base that program off our training numbers, modify it depending on what we can hit one day or 1 week. And I saw a little bit of data when I interned at TC Boost, especially with the machine that they use called the 1080 Sprint, where Steve, you, Zach, use that machine to kind of see the numbers that they're hitting on that machine and modify the training around that, and trying to improve the numbers on that with kind of like a contrast training method. So that was pretty cool to see.
Yeah,
how you kind of interpreted the data and modified your training based on that.
Yeah, so a program, right, powerlifting or even something sport specific to like using the 1080 Sprint, right? With this program today, I'm assuming that we're going to hit numbers XYZ. Did we do that? How do I make those numbers better? But I like how you finished that up with interpreting the numbers, knowing how to make changes from there. And one thing that I really believe about sports science is it's not really the number itself. You know, like saying that you hit 500 on a back squat, which is, you know, your warm up, but saying you hit 500 on a back squat, well, that could be a really awesome week, you're ahead of schedule, or that could be garbage depending on your plan, or you could be right where you're supposed to be. And what I like about sports science is it's this scientific method or this system of thinking where it's how do you use these numbers with this context of the plan, the hypothesis, the program, and then even leveling up your sports science in this high performance training model is you have all of these different things that fall under this umbrella of stuff that can be quantified that can make us better at sports. So sports science leveling up is having a sports scientist, someone that knows how to collect good data with this scientific method, someone that knows how to communicate it with all different people involved, and someone who just knows how to like foster this process. So it's not really the numbers. It's this way of thinking and what do you do about it based on this hypothesis, the plan, the progress. Because I'm sure if you ask the sport nutritionist, the sports psychologist, the sport coach, and strength coach, well, they're going to say they have to lose body fat, they have to spend more mental time training, they have to spend more time on the court, and that they have to get stronger. Well, I'm sure all of those could help, but which one is the most return on investment, right? Which one's going to be most worth our time? So it's really kind of putting it all together. And that's why the data by itself, like I said, doesn't really mean anything, because you have to put it together. Like, what does that number mean? So then they work in this kind of high performance model with everyone else. So if you had to kind of re-summarize what you learned about sports science or just a new definition, what would you say?
Let's say it's interpreting the data that you get from different studies or training methods and learning how to base your training around that to maximize performance.
Yeah, putting it all together, where there's so much more than just kind of beyond the number itself. So I would like to say thank you very much for your time. I hope you were able to learn a little bit about sports science and squat heavy.
Yes, sir. Good talk.
I'm joined by Dr. Aaron Kananen, who is the minor league sports science coordinator for the San Francisco Giants. How are you doing today?
Doing good, Matt. Good to see you again.
You as well. So I'm super excited to talk about sports science, this thing that we both know and love. So if you had to give a definition of sports science, what would it be?
It might sound a little like trite or whatever, but sports science is really the scientific study of sport. So it's the application of the scientific method and scientific principles like objective thinking, logical thinking, rationality, those sorts of things to any process in sport. It's not necessarily training related. A lot of times it has to do with like performance outcomes.
All of these different variables, let alone the athlete itself. But when you're in quote unquote a high performance model, the sports scientist, it's really not about the numbers that they collect. It's how they collect it, it's how they communicate it, because the athlete, the sport coach, the athletic trainer, the strength coach, they're all going to want different numbers and they're all going to understand numbers differently. So the sports scientist is really just like the manager, communicator of all of the data and like putting it all together. One thing I've illustrated a lot is that there's context.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So you mentioned systems as well. So could you talk about kind of like systematic thinking or just a brief overview on how you just integrate systems within sports science?
When you're working within a team, you don't always have the luxury of being able to carry out formal scientific processes. And so in that way, I think the application of those scientific principles more so than the scientific method per se becomes really important. And so from a systematic thinking or systematic approach, different things like keeping detailed notes of training circumstances or environment, when you're playing different matches, keeping track of things like the temperature, the time of day, the type of surface that you're playing on, all of those things can, from the sense of contextual factors, can have a big impact on performance, hydration, fatigue levels, injury risk. Systematic thinking is really, to me, about trying to gather or document as many of those different variables as possible, and then using, going back to like logical thinking, rational thinking, trying to carry out or draw a line between like what each of these variables, how those variables could impact something related to performance.
One phrase that I got that I really like is the system is the solution, right? It's not the actual number that is the solution. It's this way of thinking, both from a scientific principle and a training principle, but then also just a systematic way of thinking. So if you have all of these big rocks in place, you can somewhat manage or try to mitigate, all of the craziness that goes on in sport and applied sports science, to then give yourself the best shot of making better guesses, better hypotheses, the scientific method, better chances of having a variety of different ways to communicate with all those important stakeholders, right? Just the different staff members as well as the athletes themselves.
But, to your point about asking better questions, creating better hypotheses, or just creating more efficiency within like whatever your method is to achieve success, I think sports science takes out a lot of guesswork, or just kind of streamlines that process a little bit.
Definitely. So systematic, efficient creation of context, which then leads to better communication and putting it all together for this crazy thing we call sports science. So thank you very much for your time and for talking
Absolutely.
some shop, some sports science. And I'm looking forward to the next one.
Thanks, Matt. I appreciate it. You too.